The wrought iron gates, their scrollwork mimicking intertwined ivy and bearing a discreet, gilded A, swung open without a sound, a mechanical ghost sliding back into itself. For Grace Peterson, sitting in the back of a service car as silent as the gates, the sensation was one of being swallowed. The ensuing driveway, lined with century-old oaks, formed a somber and shadowy tunnel, even under the pale afternoon sun. Each tree seemed like an ancient guardian, a silent witness to a level of wealth she could only comprehend through movies and novels. The Albright estate wasn't just a house. It was an ecosystem, a small kingdom sealed off from the world Grace knew. A world of late-rent bustling markets and the constant smell of onions and garlic wafting through the hallway of her modest apartment building. Her hands, calloused from ceaseless work with knives and hot pans, rested in her lap, clutching the thick fabric of her single travel bag. Inside, carefully folded in a linen pouch, was her uniform. Or rather, her uniforms. 3 identical sets, a white that had once been vibrant but had now settled into a soft ivory, yellowed by time and countless washings. The cuffs and collars were slightly frayed, but she had mended them with tiny, almost invisible stitches, a testament to both her care and her necessity. They were clean, impeccably so, but they were undeniably old. When the car crunched to a halt on the perfectly raked gravel before the main entrance, a heavy silence descended. The driver, a man of few words and a professional gaze, simply nodded, indicating she should get out. Grace took a deep breath, the crisp air, scented with cut grass and flowers she couldn't name, filling her lungs. The mansion's facade was a masterpiece of classical architecture, with marble columns that rose to a triangular pediment, its tall, dark windows like vacant eyes observing her arrival. The door, made of solid wood with a polished bronze lion's head knocker, was open before she even mounted the first of 5 stone steps. A tall, slender woman with black hair pulled into a severe bun and a navy silk dress that whispered of elegance and expense stood in the doorway. Her eyes, a chilly gray, scanned Grace from head to toe, lingering for a fraction of a second on her worn shoes and mended bag. The scrutiny was so swift and efficient that Grace felt as if she had been assessed, weighed, and found wanting in under 3 seconds. "Miss Peterson?" the woman asked, her voice as sharp and cold as her gaze. It wasn't quite a question, but a confirmation of an inevitable and perhaps unwelcome presence. "Yes, ma'am. Grace Peterson." "I am Eleanor Vance, Mr. Albright's sister-in-law and the administrator of this house," she introduced herself, offering no handshake. "Follow me, and please, use the service entrance from now on. The driver should have informed you." The rebuke was subtle but clear, immediately establishing the hierarchy of the place. Grace felt her face flush, but she only nodded, following Eleanor's imposing figure into the grand foyer. The interior was even more overwhelming than the exterior. The black and white marble floor stretched out like a chessboard for giants. The vaulted ceiling was painted with frescoes of angels and clouds, and a crystal chandelier the size of a small car hung in the center, refracting the light into 1,000 tiny rainbows. It was a place of cold beauty, a museum inhabited by ghosts and memories. Eleanor led her through silent corridors, where the only sound was the echo of their own footsteps, until they reached the kitchen. And what a kitchen it was! It was a sanctuary of stainless steel and state-of-the-art technology, industrial stoves, convection ovens, a central island of black granite so polished Grace could see her own anxious reflection in it. There were more gadgets and appliances here than she had seen in her entire professional life. But for all its modernity, the place was sterile. There was no smell of baking bread, of simmering stock, or of fresh herbs. It smelled of cleaning products and disuse. "This was Isabella's kitchen," Eleanor said, stopping in the center of the room. Her tone shifted, taking on a frigid reverence. "My late sister. She was an artist. Every dish was a masterpiece. Mr. Albright worshipped her cooking. Since she's been gone, no one has truly cooked in here. We've had temporary chefs, catering services. All have failed to replicate her magic. The message was clear. Grace was treading on sacred ground and was destined to fail. Your room is upstairs with the other staff. Your duties will begin tomorrow morning. For tonight, Mr. Albright has requested a simple meal. Something comforting. He hasn't had much of an appetite. Left alone, Grace felt the weight of those words and that environment. Comforting. How could one create comfort in a place so devoid of it? She opened the refrigerators and pantries, finding the best ingredients money could buy: organic vegetables, prime cuts of meat, exotic spices. But it all felt soulless. She thought of the complex menus she had studied, the French techniques she had honed. Nothing seemed right. Then she closed her eyes for a moment and transported herself to another kitchen, a small, warm kitchen, with cast-iron pans hanging on the wall and a pot of fresh basil on the windowsill. Her grandmother's kitchen. She remembered the smell of the lentil stew her grandmother made on cold days, a simple rustic dish, but one that held more love and history in a single spoonful than any soufflé or terrine. It was a family recipe, passed down through generations, written in her grandmother's looping cursive in a worn, leather-bound notebook. The decision was made. She would not try to imitate the legendary Isabella Albright. She would not try to impress with flashy techniques. She would cook with the only magic she knew: memory. She set to work, her movements, once hesitant, becoming fluid and confident. The rhythmic sound of the knife on the cutting board, the sizzle of the onions slowly browning in olive oil, the aroma of thyme and bay leaf releasing their perfumes. Slowly, the sterile kitchen began to come alive. The scent rising from the pot was rich, earthy, and deeply welcoming. It was the smell of home, of safety, of a hug in the form of food. When the stew was finally ready, rich and thick, Grace felt a flicker of pride. It was honest. It was hers. She ladled a generous portion into a fine porcelain bowl, feeling the stark contrast between the dish's simplicity and the opulence of the dinnerware. As she prepared the tray, she heard the sound of slow, heavy footsteps approaching down the hall. Not the quick, decisive steps of Eleanor. These were shuffling, heavier. The kitchen door swung open slowly, revealing a tall man with slumped shoulders, wearing an expensive but rumpled suit. His graying hair was unkempt, and there was a shadow of profound grief in his eyes. It was Mr. Albright, the embittered billionaire, drawn from the darkness of his mourning by the scent of a memory that was not his own. He stopped at the threshold, his gaze fixed on the pot still simmering gently on the stove. His face, once a mask of indifference, contorted into an expression of utter, absolute bewilderment. He inhaled deeply, and for an instant, the pain in his eyes was replaced by something she couldn't decipher: a flash of shock, of recognition, and of overwhelming anguish. He raised his gaze to Grace, not looking at her as a new employee, but as if seeing a ghost. "Where?" he began, his voice hoarse and fragile, freighted with an emotion that seemed to tear through him. "Where did you get this recipe?" Mr. Albright's question hung in the steam-filled air, as heavy and unexpected as his presence itself. A chill ran down Grace's spine, the kind of sudden fear that comes when you've made a mistake without knowing how. Her fingers, which had worked with such certainty just moments before, now felt foreign and clumsy. She swallowed hard, her mouth suddenly dry. Before her, the billionaire seemed to have shrunk inside his expensive suit. The authority one would expect from a man of his stature had vanished, replaced by a raw, almost childlike vulnerability. His eyes didn't accuse her but pleaded with her, as if she held a secret vital to his existence. The aroma of the stew, which moments ago had filled her with pride and a connection to her roots, now felt like a trap, a fragrance that had summoned a ghost only Mr. Albright could see. "Sir?" she managed to say, her voice a trembling thread. "It's just lentil stew. A family recipe. Family? He repeated, the words sounding like heresy on his lips. He took another step into the kitchen, approaching the pot like a pilgrim approaching a shrine. He leaned in, closing his eyes as he inhaled the steam. No, he whispered, more to himself than to her. It isn't just lentil stew. It is the lentil stew. The thyme, the bay leaf. There's a touch of cumin, isn't there? And a drop of balsamic vinegar at the end, to balance the sweetness of the carrots. This is the dish Isabella used to make, on rainy Sundays. It was the smell of our home. The pain in his voice was so palpable that Grace felt a pang of compassion that eclipsed her fear. She was witnessing a man drowning in grief, and the life raft he had just spotted was her soup. At that exact moment, the sharp click of heels on marble announced Eleanor's arrival. She swept into the kitchen with the urgency of a general arriving at an unexpected battlefield. Her eyes took in the scene. Mr. Albright, her brother-in-law, mesmerized by a cooking pot, and the new cook, pale and frightened. The disapproval on her face was a mask of ice. "Arthur? What are you doing in here? You should be resting," she said, her voice low but charged with authority. She subtly positioned herself between Grace and Mr. Albright, a human shield of silk and suspicion. "Eleanor, smell this," Albright said, not taking his eyes off the pot. "It's her dish. It's exactly the same." Eleanor cast a disdainful glance at the pot and then at Grace. "It's a rustic stew, Arthur. A coincidence, nothing more. This woman likely has a limited repertoire." The insult was deliberate, designed to diminish Grace, to render her an insignificant variable. "It's not a coincidence." Albright's voice rose, cracking with an emotion that wasn't just sadness, but anger. A fury born from pain. "It's identical. Every note, every nuance. How is this possible?" He finally turned to face Grace, and now his eyes bored into her, the plea replaced by a desperate demand for answers. "I asked you where you got this recipe." "I already told you, sir. It's from my grandmother," Grace insisted, feeling the need to defend not only herself but the memory of her family. "She cooked it for me since I was a child. Her recipe book." "The recipe book?" Albright echoed the phrase, and something in his expression shattered. He looked at Eleanor, a dark understanding passing between them. Eleanor, in turn, narrowed her eyes. The gears of her calculating mind were almost audible. "Isabella's book," Eleanor said, her voice a venomous hiss. "Where is it, Arthur?" "In the safe, where it's always been since—" He trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. "Since his wife died." Eleanor turned her full attention to Grace, her body tense, the very picture of distrust. "My sister, Mrs. Albright, was a culinary genius. She spent years perfecting her creations, compiling them into a single leather-bound book. It was her masterpiece, her soul. It was never published. Only one copy exists. She guarded it with her life." Every word was a stone being laid in the foundation of an accusation. "It's curious, isn't it, that on your very first day, out of the hundreds of dishes you could have made, you chose to prepare the one recipe that could have such a profound effect on Mr. Albright. A recipe that, according to him, is identical to one of Isabella's most personal creations." The air in the kitchen grew thin. Grace felt as if the stainless steel walls were closing in on her. Eleanor's twisted logic was terrifying in its effectiveness. She was being painted not as a cook, but as a conspirator, an intruder with a nefarious plan. "But that's impossible," Grace stammered. "I've never seen your sister's book. I've never even heard of it until this second. This recipe is from my grandmother, I swear." "You swear?" Eleanor smirked, a thin, cruel twist of her lips. "How convenient. An anonymous grandmother. A recipe book no one has seen. Tell me, Miss Peterson, did you research the Albright family before you accepted this position? Did you know about Mr. Albright's tragic loss? Did you know about my sister's reputation in the kitchen? The insinuation was clear and sickening, that Grace had staged the entire thing, that she was a fortune-hunting charlatan who had somehow discovered a household secret to ingratiate herself with a vulnerable billionaire. No, I would never do that. Grace's voice finally found its strength, fueled by indignation. I am a cook. That is all I am. I found the job through an agency. I was told the position required discretion and skill, nothing more. Mr. Albright, who had been silent during Eleanor's indictment, was now looking at Grace with a new light in his eyes. The confusion and pain had mingled with the seed of suspicion planted by his sister-in-law. He wanted to believe in the magic of the moment, in the inexplicable comfort that aroma had brought him, but the world had taught him to be skeptical, to see conspiracies instead of coincidences. The mansion, with its wealth and isolation, was fertile ground for distrust. Tomorrow morning, he said, his voice firm now, reclaiming a fraction of his lost authority. He was no longer speaking to the apparition of his wife, but to an employee whose presence had become a problem. You will cook for me again. I want to see what else you can do. I want to see your repertoire. He used Eleanor's word, but with a different weight. It was no longer an insult, it was a challenge, a test. He turned and left the kitchen without tasting a single spoonful of the stew that had turned his world upside down. Eleanor lingered for another moment, a look of cold triumph on her face. I suggest you don't disappoint us, she said quietly, before following her brother-in-law, leaving Grace alone in the deafening silence of the immaculate kitchen. The comforting aroma of her grandmother's stew now seemed like the stench of her own ruin. She looked at the pot, at the food that was her heritage, and for the first time in her life, she was afraid to cook. The night at the Albright mansion was a different kind of darkness. It wasn't Grace's urban darkness, punctuated by distant sirens and the orange glow of streetlights, but a deep, velvety silence, an almost total absence of sound and light that seemed to have weight and substance. In her modest room, located in the staff wing, a space as clean and impersonal as the rest of the house, Grace couldn't sleep. The bed was comfortable, the sheets a quality of cotton she had rarely experienced, but her mind was a whirlwind of anxiety and indignation. Eleanor's words echoed in her head, twisting her heritage, her only true possession, into a weapon of manipulation. The accusation that she had researched Mr. Albright's life to take advantage of his pain was the vilest thing anyone had ever said about her. Her grandmother, a simple, loving woman whose greatest legacy was teaching her granddaughter to find joy and comfort in food, was being posthumously turned into an accomplice to a non-existent crime. Grace got up and went to the small window. Outside, the moon bathed the perfectly manicured gardens in a silvery, ghostly light. The beauty of the place now seemed sinister, an elegant facade for the bitterness and suspicion rotting within. She felt trapped, a butterfly caught in a silken web. Her first instinct was to run, to grab her mended bag at dawn and disappear through those silent gates, leaving behind the wealth, the pain, and the accusations. But then, the image of Mr. Albright's face returned to her. The bewilderment, the overwhelming pain, that flicker of recognition. For a brief instant before suspicion poisoned him, she had seen a man who wasn't a billionaire, but a widower whose broken heart had, for a moment, found the echo of a lost happiness. And stronger than the fear, a fierce stubbornness arose. Her grandmother's recipe was honest. Her work was honest. She would not be driven out like a thief for cooking with her soul. At dawn, Grace was already on her feet. She put on her white, frayed uniform, feeling it like a suit of armor. Before going downstairs, she opened her bag and took out a small object wrapped in a velvet cloth. It was her grandmother's recipe book. The leather cover was cracked with age, the pages yellowed and stained with traces of flour, olive oil, and decades of love. On the first page, her grandmother's elegant cursive read, "For my granddaughter Grace, may your kitchen always be your sanctuary and your joy." Grace traced the letters with her fingertips. This was her shield. She wouldn't take it to the kitchen. It was too sacred to be exposed to the cynicism of that place. But having it nearby, in her room, gave her strength. When she entered the kitchen, she found Eleanor already there, sitting on a high stool by the granite island, an untouched cup of tea before her. She looked like a sentinel, a silken gargoyle guarding her domain. Her gray eyes locked onto Grace the moment she walked in. "Good morning," Eleanor said, the cordiality sounding more like a threat. "Mr. Albright has requested a simple breakfast, eggs Benedict, and he wants them perfect. Isabella's hollandaise sauce was legendary, light yet rich, with the precise acidity of the lemon. She used to say the secret was in maintaining a constant temperature, in never letting the emulsion break." The message was clear. "You are being tested against the perfection of a dead woman." Grace just nodded, tying her apron with a firm knot. She refused to let Eleanor's intimidation rattle her. Today, she wouldn't cook from her grandmother's memory. She would cook with her own skill, the technique she had honed in hot, chaotic kitchens where perfection wasn't a luxury but a necessity to keep her job. She began to work in silence, each movement precise and economical. Eleanor's presence was a physical pressure on her back, watching every gesture, every ingredient she reached for. Grace could feel her waiting for a mistake, for a moment of hesitation. She prepared the water to poach the eggs, adding a touch of white vinegar, as she'd been taught. As the water heated, she began the hollandaise sauce, the heart of the dish. In a metal bowl over a saucepan of simmering water, she beat the egg yolks with lemon juice and a pinch of salt. The whisk spun in her hands with hypnotic speed, the rhythmic, metallic sound echoing in the silent kitchen. Slowly, stream by stream, she began to add the melted, clarified butter. It was a delicate dance of temperature and motion. If the heat was too high, the yolks would scramble. If the butter was added too quickly, the emulsion would separate. Eleanor said nothing, but Grace could feel her critical gaze, waiting for disaster. But the disaster never came. Under Grace's skilled hands, the sauce began to thicken, transforming into a pale gold ribbon, glossy and velvety. She tasted it, adjusted the salt and lemon, and set it in a warm place. Next, she toasted the English muffins, seared the slices of Canadian bacon, and at the exact right moment, poached the eggs, lifting them from the water with a slotted spoon, perfectly cooked, the yolk still liquid inside. The assembly was quick and elegant. The muffin, the bacon, the perfectly round egg, and finally, a generous spoonful of the flawless hollandaise, finished with a sprinkle of paprika and fresh chives. The plate was a picture of classic perfection. When she was done, she placed the two plates on a tray. Eleanor stood up, walked over, and inspected the result. She dipped the tip of a small spoon into the sauce left in the bowl. She brought it to her lips, and for a microsecond, Grace saw a flicker of genuine surprise cross the woman's face. It was so fast she almost doubted she had seen it, but it had been there. The surprise was immediately replaced by her usual cold mask. "Acceptable," Eleanor said, the word uttered begrudgingly. "Take it to Mr. Albright. He's in the library." Carrying the tray, Grace felt her heart pounding. This was no longer a simple breakfast. It was her testimony, her defense. The library was a dark room, its walls lined with books from floor to ceiling. Mr. Albright was sitting in a leather armchair, staring at an oil portrait of a beautiful, smiling woman hanging over the fireplace. Isabella. Grace placed the tray on a small table beside him, in silence. He ignored her for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the portrait. Then, he finally looked down at the plate. He picked up the fork and knife with a tired hesitation. He cut into the egg, and the golden liquid yolk ran out, mixing with the hollandaise, exactly as it should. He brought a bite to his mouth. He chewed slowly, his face inscrutable. He said nothing. There was no flash of recognition, no emotional outburst like the night before, just a heavy, analytical silence. After swallowing, He put down his silverware and pushed the plate away, the food barely touched. "For lunch," he said, his voice devoid of any warmth, his eyes on the woman in the painting. "Prepare her coq au vin." He turned to Grace, and his eyes were cold as steel. "The exact recipe is in the book Eleanor claims you stole." Mr. Albright's command hit Grace with the force of a physical blow. "Prepare her coq au vin. The exact recipe is in the book Eleanor claims you stole." The words were a cruel paradox, a logical trap from which there was no escape. He was ordering her to perform a task for which the only instruction manual was the very object she was accused of possessing. It was an impossible test, designed not to gauge her culinary skill, but to force a confession. For a moment, Grace stood paralyzed, the tray still in her hands, the scent of the impeccable hollandaise sauce now seeming nauseating. The library, with its thousands of books, silent witnesses to centuries of knowledge and stories, had been transformed into a courtroom, and she had already been judged guilty. "Mr. Albright, with all due respect," she began, her voice surprisingly steady despite the panic freezing her veins. "How can I possibly cook a recipe from a book I don't have? A book I've never even seen?" At that moment, Eleanor swept into the library as if summoned by the tension in the air. She carried a small silver key in her fingers. Her face wore an expression of grave solemnity, the mask of a person about to perform an unpleasant but necessary duty. She didn't look at Grace, addressing only her brother-in-law. "Arthur! I knew this would happen," she said, her tone one of feigned sorrow. Her audacity last night, it was a test. She wanted to see how deep your grief ran, how vulnerable you were. The stew was bait, a cruel performance to gain your trust. She turned to Grace, her gray eyes devoid of any compassion. "Enough of these games, Miss Peterson. Where is it?" "Where is what?" Grace retorted, frustration and anger beginning to overcome her fear. "I don't have anything that belongs to you, except a day's wages I haven't even received yet." "My sister's recipe book!" Eleanor's voice rose, sharp and cutting. The one possession Arthur couldn't lock away, because it was the only thing that brought him any comfort to look through on bad nights. "I last saw it on the shelf in this very library 2 days ago, before your arrival. This morning, after last night's incident, I thought it prudent to check. And it is no longer there." She approached Mr. Albright, showing him the silver key. "This is the key to the safe where the original, secure copy is kept. Isabella's daily use copy, the one she kept here, has vanished." The accusation was complete. The final puzzle piece snapped into place. The book's disappearance, combined with Grace's mysterious recipe, formed a damning picture. For Mr. Albright, mired in his pain and paranoia, it was an easier narrative to believe than that of a miraculous coincidence. The magic had become a betrayal. "My room. You can search my room," Grace offered, her voice desperate. "My bag. I have nothing to hide." It was a gesture of submission, the only defense she had left. "Oh, I have no doubt we would find nothing now," Eleanor scoffed. "You're not stupid. You've likely already mailed it to an accomplice or hidden it somewhere off the property. Planning to sell it, no doubt. Isabella Albright's recipes would be worth a fortune to collectors or high-end culinary magazines." Mr. Albright, who had been silent during the exchange, rose slowly from his armchair. He was a tall man, and his grief did not diminish the aura of power that surrounded him. He walked to the fireplace and stared up at his wife's portrait. The woman in the painting smiled on, oblivious to the ugly scene unfolding in her honor. "Isabella trusted people," Albright said, his voice low and laden with a deep bitterness. "She saw the good in everyone. She would have liked you, your talent. She would have given you a chance. I am no longer that person. The world took that from me." He turned, and his eyes met Grace's. The coldness from before was gone, replaced by a resigned pain, the exhaustion of a man who simply could not bear the weight of another disappointment. I don't need to search your belongings, Miss Peterson. I agree we wouldn't find it, but the facts are undeniable. You arrive, and on your first day, you inexplicably cook my wife's secret dish. The next day, the book containing that very recipe disappears. He paused, the silence in the room absolute. You have until the end of the day to return the book. Place it discreetly back on the shelf. No questions will be asked. You will receive your pay and a neutral letter of reference, and you will leave. If the book does not appear by nightfall, I will be forced to call the police and formally charge you with theft. The ultimatum was final. An axe hanging over her head. Involving the police would mean the end of her career. No one would hire a cook with a theft charge on her record, whether it was proven or not. The stain would last forever. She would be thrown back into a world of uncertainty and poverty, but this time, without the one thing that had always sustained her, her impeccable reputation. The injustice of the situation was suffocating. She looked at Eleanor's triumphant face and Mr. Albright's exhausted one. They lived in a world where guilt was an easier conclusion than the truth, where a cook in old clothes was a potential thief by definition. The anger inside her morphed into something colder, harder. Desperation. And in the depths of that desperation, an image flashed in her mind. A worn photograph, its edges curled, that she kept tucked beside her grandmother's notebook. A black and white photo of two young girls, smiling and arm in arm in front of a market stall. One of them was her grandmother, young and full of life. The other was a girl with the same radiant smile as the portrait over the fireplace. It was a chance. A tiny, almost insane chance. A relic from a forgotten past that might be the only key to her future. She wouldn't reveal it now. Not in this hostile environment, where anything she said would be twisted and used against her. She needed the right moment. She had to create an opportunity where they would have no choice but to listen. Grace lifted her chin. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach. But now there was also a spark of determination. She would not simply vanish into the night like a thief. "I understand, sir," she said, her voice calm, to the surprise of both Eleanor and Albright himself. "I did not steal the book, and by the end of the day, I will prove it." She turned and walked out of the library, leaving behind a confused billionaire and a sister-in-law whose victorious expression now held a flicker of uncertainty. Grace didn't know exactly how she would do it, but she knew what she had to do. She wasn't going to cook the coq au vin. She was going to prepare the truth. The next few hours dragged by with torturous slowness. To any outside observer, the kitchen of the Albright mansion was in full operation. But it wasn't the sound of work, it was the sound of war. Grace moved with a calmness that bordered on ritualistic. She wasn't preparing a meal for lunch, she was forging her defense. She ignored the order to make coq au vin. To attempt to recreate a dish from a book she didn't possess would be to admit defeat, to play their game. Instead, she turned once again to her only source of truth, her grandmother's legacy. Flipping through the fragile pages of the notebook in her room, she searched for something unmistakable, a culinary signature as unique as a fingerprint. And she found it. A recipe for a dessert. Isabella's Torte. A dense, moist, flourless chocolate and almond cake, a specialty that, according to her grandmother's notes, had been perfected during a trip the two friends took to the Italian coast in their youth. She went down to the kitchen, her heart hammering against her ribs, but her hands were steady. Eleanor was absent, likely savoring her impending victory. All the better. Grace worked without interruption. She melted the finest quality bittersweet chocolate, the rich, familiar aroma filling the air. She beat egg whites until they formed stiff, glossy peaks. She ground the almonds, releasing their oily perfume. Each step was a meditation, a silent prayer to the memory of her grandmother and the friendship she was about to reveal. The kitchen, once a sterile and intimidating space, was now her stage. The scent wafting from the oven wasn't just cake baking. It was the smell of the truth being cooked, an undeniable and delicious truth that would soon permeate the entire house. When the torte was ready, perfect, with a delicately cracked crust and an interior that promised pure indulgence, Grace placed it in the center of the granite island. She didn't slice it. She left it whole, a complete work of art. Next to it, she placed two objects. The first was her grandmother's recipe book, open to the yellowed, stained page with the recipe for Isabella's torte. The second, she kept face down. With everything prepared, she sought out one of the few staff members with whom she had exchanged a sympathetic glance, a young housekeeper named Clara. "Please," Grace said in a low voice, "could you inform Mr. Albright and Mrs. Vance that I am waiting for them in the kitchen? Tell them it's about the book, that I've found a solution." The message had the desired effect. Minutes later, Eleanor and Mr. Albright entered the kitchen. Eleanor wore an air of triumphant impatience, expecting a confession and the return of the book. Mr. Albright just looked weary, a man eager for the day and all its unpleasant drama to be over. "Well," Eleanor began, crossing her arms, "have you decided to stop this charade? Where is the book?" Grace didn't answer her. Her eyes were fixed on Mr. Albright. "Sir," she said, her voice clear and resonant in the quiet kitchen, "you accused me of stealing your wife's book to cook a recipe. What I have to say is that, yes, I did cook one of Mrs. Albright's recipes, but I didn't use her book." With a deliberate gesture, she pushed her grandmother's old notebook across the polished granite toward him. "I used this one." Mr. Albright looked down at the ancient notebook, at the looping cursive and the page titled Isabella's Torte. His brow furrowed in confusion. Eleanor let out a short, dismissive laugh. "What is this? A forgery? You spent all afternoon creating this piece of theater? It's pathetic." "It's not a forgery," Grace continued, maintaining her calm. "It's my grandmother's recipe book, Annalise Peterson's, and this torte," she gestured to the dessert, "is the Isabella's torte that you know, because it was Isabella who gave this recipe to my grandmother more than 40 years ago." Albright picked up the notebook with trembling hands. He thumbed through a few pages, the confusion on his face giving way to a growing astonishment. He recognized the style, the way the instructions were written, small notes in the margins. They were echoes of his own wife's style. "That's impossible," Eleanor said, her voice a little less certain now. "Isabella never shared her recipes with anyone. They were her treasure." "She shared them with her best friend," Grace said, and then she picked up the second object on the island and turned it over. It was the old, black-and-white photograph. She slid it in front of Mr. Albright, next to the book. The world seemed to stop for an instant. Mr. Albright stared at the photo, and his breath caught in his throat. Eleanor leaned in to see, and her face lost all its color. In the photo, two teenage girls, no older than 16, were smiling at the camera, arm in arm. One was unmistakably a young Isabella, full of life and with the same smile as the portrait in the library. The other was a dark-haired girl with sparkling eyes. "The one on the left," Grace said, her voice thick with emotion, "is my Grandma Annalise. They grew up together in the same neighborhood, long before you, Mr. Albright, long before all this wealth. They were like sisters. They cooked together in my great-grandmother's tiny kitchen. When my grandmother got married, Isabella was still perfecting her recipes. As a wedding gift, she gave my grandmother a copy of the book she was just beginning to write, hand-copied by herself. It was a promise that no matter where life took them, they would always share the same table." Mr. Albright reached out and touched the photograph as if it were a sacred relic. A part of his wife's life he had never known was right there, in black and white, in the kitchen of his mansion, and Isabella before she was Mrs. Albright. He looked up at Grace, and the pain, anger, and suspicion had vanished, replaced by a profound awe and remorse. He finally understood. The lentil stew wasn't a coincidence. It was a shared heritage, an echo of a friendship lost to time. Grace then turned to Eleanor, and for the first time, she was the one in control, the accuser. "I have my copy of the book. I've always had it. It's my family's most precious possession. I never needed to steal Isabella's copy." Her eyes narrowed, cold and piercing. Which brings us to the real question. If I didn't need to steal it, who did? Who knew the book was in the library? Who coveted it, perhaps for years, believing themselves to be the rightful heir to everything that was Isabella's? Who saw my arrival, a stranger in old clothes, as the perfect opportunity to finally take the book for themselves and place the blame on someone no one would ever believe? Each question was a blow, and Eleanor flinched as if she had been physically struck. The silence in the kitchen was deafening, broken only by the soft hum of one of the refrigerators. Mr. Albright lifted his gaze from the photograph, turning his shocked and newly illuminated face toward his sister-in-law. The truth, just like the aroma of the torte, had completely filled the room, and it was irrefutable. The silence that followed Grace's accusation was thicker and more telling than any shouted confession. Eleanor's face, normally a mask of icy control, crumbled. The initial shock gave way to a flush of fury, and underneath it all, an unmistakable panic in her eyes. She opened her mouth to protest, to construct another of her elaborate lies, but the sound that emerged was only an incoherent stammer. The photograph and the old recipe book on the granite island were artifacts of a truth so fundamental that no denial could stand against them. They were irrefutable proof not only of Grace's innocence, but of history itself. Mr. Albright, however, was barely looking at his sister-in-law. His eyes, now clear of the fog of pain and suspicion, were fixed on Grace, but it was as if he were seeing her for the first time. He saw the resemblance in her eyes, the same honesty that shone in Annalise's photo. He saw the quiet strength of a woman who, when cornered and humiliated, didn't resort to pleas but to her own heritage for her defense. And then, he turned slowly to Eleanor. His voice, when he spoke, was not loud, but it carried the weight of steel, the voice of a man who had awakened from a long and bitter sleep. "That was why," he said, the realization dawning on him. "That was why you always belittled her. Lucky talent, you called her. A housewife with a hobby. You could never stand the fact that Isabella's gift was genuine. It didn't come from expensive classes or exotic ingredients, but from herself, from this friendship, from this joy." He gestured to encompass the photo and the book. "And you wanted to possess that magic, to lock it up, to control it like you control everything else in this house." He didn't even have to ask. He knew. "It's in her study, isn't it? Hidden among the art books you know I never touch. The most obvious and therefore the safest place." Eleanor's expression confirmed everything. The last remnant of her composure shattered. "It was mine by right," she spat, her voice finally finding its strength in a torrent of venom and resentment. "I was her sister. I took care of her when she was sick. I managed this house. I kept her memory alive. And what did I get? Her shadow. Always Isabella's shadow. The perfect cook. The perfect wife. That book was the only part of her that I could have. That would be mine alone." "You never understood, Eleanor," Albright said, the sadness in his voice deeper than his anger. "Isabella's legacy wasn't in a leather-bound book. It was in the joy she created, something you could never steal because you were never able to feel it." He didn't need to say anything more. The words hung in the air like a final verdict. "Have one of the drivers take you wherever you want to go. Your things will be sent later." Without another word, Eleanor turned and walked out of the kitchen. Her steps were no longer those of a queen in her castle, but of a discovered thief, hurried and disgraced, echoing down the hall until they faded away. A new silence settled over the kitchen, but this one was different. It was a silence of relief, of space. The air felt lighter. Mr. Albright stood motionless for a long moment, looking at the photograph, the book, and the untouched tort. He looked like a man who had lost a ghost only to find a real person in its place. "I am so sorry," he said finally, turning to Grace. His voice was thick with emotion, stripped of all its billionaire formality. "The things I thought, the things I allowed to be said to you in this house. There is no excuse for my blindness. I was so focused on protecting a memory that I nearly destroyed her living legacy." His eyes met hers, and the gratitude was palpable. "You didn't just bring me a recipe, Miss Peterson. You brought me back a part of my wife I never had the privilege of knowing. The girl who laughed with her friend at a market stall." Grace nodded, accepting the apology. The anger and fear that had sustained her throughout the day dissipated, leaving a serene exhaustion. "She was a good friend," Grace said simply. "My grandmother spoke of her whole life." Mr. Albright's gaze fell upon Isabella's tort, still in the center of the island, exuding its aroma of chocolate and promises. A dish made not out of obligation or as a test, but out of love and memory. "It seems a waste, not to taste it," he said, a trace of a melancholy smile touching his lips for the first time. Grace took a knife, cut a perfect slice of the tort, and placed it on a porcelain plate. She handed it to Mr. Albright. He picked up a fork, and with the same hesitation he'd had that morning, brought a bite to his mouth. This time, however, his eyes closed. A single tear escaped and slid down his face. It was not a tear of pain, but of rediscovery. It was the taste of the past, the flavor of his wife's youth, a story of friendship told in chocolate and almonds. "Stay," he said, his voice firm. "Please. Not as an employee under suspicion, but as a guardian. This place," he looked around the sterile kitchen, "doesn't need to be a museum. It needs life. It needs to smell like baking bread again." Grace looked down at her hands, calloused and strong. She looked at her grandmother's notebook next to the faded photograph. She thought of her clean but old uniform. For the first time, in this opulent place, she didn't feel like an intruder. She felt like a connection, the bridge between the past and the future. "I'll stay," she said, "but on one condition." Mr. Albright raised his eyebrows, ready to agree to anything. "Tomorrow," Grace said, a glint of confidence in her eyes. "We'll cook together. We're going to make the lentil stew, using both books, Isabella's and Annalise's, and we're going to make it the right way." A genuine smile, the first in years, lit up Mr. Albright's face. "I would love that," he said. That evening, the Albright mansion felt different. The scent of chocolate lingered softly in the corridors, and in the kitchen, now a sanctuary of two intertwined histories. A cook in a worn old uniform finally untied her apron, not as a servant, but as the lady of that domain, ready, on the morrow, to fill it with the richest of all ingredients, the truth.